Hey, Shira. I don't think I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Perfect. Awesome. Just saying hello to everyone. You did a great job leading the last EAG meeting. Thank you so much for doing that.
No problem. Yeah, I think it went pretty smoothly.
Yeah. I'll give everyone a few more moments. I didn't have anyone reach out to say they weren't able to come, so
Hey, how's it going?
hey.
Hey, Mia, pretty good.
And I heard you saying, Ashira, that you did not hear about anyone else electing not to attend.
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, I think we should give it a minute, and then, I have some items of business that I'd like us to move forward with. So we'll see how that goes.
Sounds good.
Ben, am I thinking correctly that the DDA memo that I drafted on behalf of the group, there's nothing that's been touched with that or suggestions? Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, we uh, didn't get to it last meeting. We ran out of time, so that we did the full group did have that in terms of the meeting materials, but we didn't get a chance to discuss it.
Okay, sounds good. So, yeah, I think we should touch on it briefly because I'd love to move that out of the full EAG group. I don't expect it to be controversial, but people may have thoughts of like additional questions. I could see that being something the group wants to come up with. So we'll make sure that this working group is comfortable with what's in there and doesn't have any additional feedback. Otherwise, we'll just plan on moving that to the full EAG and asking them to approve that at the next meeting. Oh, there's Emily. Hi, Emily.
Mia, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay, great.
cannot see you just in case that's, yeah. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I think we can, get this started. I don't know if I sure didn't hear that anyone else wouldn't be attending. Emily, before you jumped on, we talked about how, there's a few items of business that I'd like to keep moving forward, before the next EAG meeting. So we'll see if anyone else joins us, but make our way through. So I had been discussing how the DDA memo wasn't discussed at the full EAG meeting due to lack of time. I don't expect that to be sort of controversial, just because I think this subgroup had good agreement on sort of the things we wanted the PUC to ask of potential DDA applicants. I do think that it's possible that other EAG members may have sort of thoughts about what to ask. But I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to add in that, or any thoughts about how we can clarify the language or anything like that. Okay.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't,
Sorry. Okay.
no, I was just gonna say I don't have anything to add to the DDA recommendation document.
Okay. Well, I think we can just consider that fine then, and I'll make sure that's the first thing we bring up in our credit issues meeting to, move that along. I think that should be really pretty straightforward. Okay. Let me just see what else I have in my notes. So and thank you, Ben, for doing the credit front loading memo. I'm glad that we got that off our desk. I don't know. I think we may have to revisit it if when the PUC, gets to asking us about that, we may find that there's material that we didn't cover in our memo, but I'm glad we didn't hold it back, and we just have a position on that. So that's great. And I think some of that will be in the final report because I imagine the legislature will have questions about that. So we'll make sure that's part of our final report, that recommendation. So the other thing that I had on our agenda today, which Dominic reminded me that I think the PUC would like feedback on, is the idea of credits serving credits for low and moderate income serving entities. We had flagged shelters or food shelves as possible ones, and I think the group was generally receptive to that. But we never really got around to coming up with a definition or kind of what we think about that. So I think this is a good time to basically try to get a definition in. I don't know that we'll be seeing like a straw proposal or anything. So I think that could be a short memo saying, assuming this is the opinion of the group, that we think these are the types of institutions that would qualify, and this is how we recommend you pursue it. And I think that would be something that would be needed in probably the statute because it's not there now. So that would have to be, I think, unless I'm, I always find it hard to know what's in the PUC's power and what isn't, but I do think that might need to be a legislative recommendation. So I guess, Emily and Ben, do you have any sort of opinions on, the viability and the wisdom of trying to open up credits for LMI serving entities?
So just to kind of define what we're talking about, are we talking about like, say, like a food pantry or like a family center, shelter, having them, I guess, basically like being the initial owners of a credit? Like if they were to install a heat pump on premises, for example, they would be the initial owners, or like how are we envisioning, I guess, like what's the scenario we're thinking of, or that you had in mind for that?
Yeah, so I think they would be the initial owners in the same way, like based on my interpretation of the PUC's rules, if a business that's not lower moderate income, can't be lower moderate income, installs that, they're still the credit owner based on my understanding of the straw proposal. So I think how this came up was saying like you could obtain credits that meet the low and moderate income obligations if you installed or delivered measures to like a nonprofit organization that serves low income households. And I think the shelters are a good example because typically we don't think of that as a household in the same way. They're usually not paying rent and they don't have utility bills, things like that. But the business, the nonprofit organization that serves those households is sort of bearing that cost. So I think it would just count towards the obligation and potentially encourage obligated parties to deliver installed measures to those organizations as well. I think the pitfalls are there's not necessarily a definition and it adds administrative complexity, but I don't necessarily see a harm in saying yes, shelters should be able to get those benefits as well. I just think you'd have to be careful how you phrased it. So that's my understanding of sort of what's on the table and where I'd stand on that. But if either of you have sort of response to that.
I think that's just, I guess the short answer would be yes. Like, absolutely. I think if you're, an obligated party who's serving, like, for example, a homeless shelter with, weatherization, heat pumps, biofuels, whatever it may be, any eligible measure, they should definitely get credit for serving a loan LMI. I think that would be a great incentive. And, of course, those institutions and businesses or nonprofits are all serving a great need in the community. So I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to incentivize that. So,
And this goes back to what we discussed last time. I'm not sure that there is a benefit to being a recipient of delivered measures in the same way as installed measures. We kind of went, Emily, I don't remember, you were there, I think, this meeting. We went back and forth on whether that's something we can, you know, assume is true, which maybe not. I don't think we would necessarily have to make a distinction in this case between installed or delivered measures. You know, if anything, I think it potentially just makes it more complicated for an obligated party to prove, you know, that this organization meets the definition. But to the extent that these are already being provided as services, I think it makes sense for that to be, you know, a credit generating activity because there's a benefit. So I don't know that people would be doing it for delivered measures anyways, because you'd have to like work with the, you know, nonprofit shelter owner to, you know, consider that they qualify, which is messy. So, you know, but I think it's like if you know, one of the EEUs is offering incentives that can benefit you know, something, an organization that provides these services. Yeah, I don't think that should be discouraged. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, some things I would think is we could say that these organizations should be nonprofits potentially. I don't know that there's many for-profit companies, so I think that's a basic one.
That was
I would
my
agree.
main question, was like, do we have some thoughts on like the parameters of organizations that support low and moderate income Vermonters? And I think, yeah, the first and only thing I have is nonprofits as well. So I agree with that.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead, Mia.
yeah, and I don't know that there's as much of a benefit for the nonprofit serving moderate income households. I'm not strongly opposed to it. I don't know that there's a ton of nonprofits that serve, you know, strictly moderate income and not low income. You know what I mean? Like I guess it's not a problem for me. I don't know that there's much there to work with.
Right.
Yeah,
No, I was just agreeing. Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of how we should, like, the wording I think is going to be key here. As to how, because I totally see where you're going with this. I think probably it should be worded in a way that, you know, basically indicates that, you know, I'm thinking of, like, for example, like a CAP agency or, you know, like a food pantry, etc. Like those are pretty clearly, you know, organizations that serve the low-income population, but, you know, there should be some language that maybe indicates that, you know, for example, that the organization, you know, has like stated in their like mission statement, or, you know, it's very clear that they serve the low-income population. You know, it's got to be, yeah, just very clear that that's the population we wouldn't want. But then again, you know, I don't know of many nonprofits who, you know, the nonprofits serve all aspects of the population, but you know, I think we all know that this nonprofits we're referring to are ones that offer, you know, basically anti-poverty services. Essentially, is, I guess, probably the type of language we'd want to be looking at. You know, because there's nonprofits that have, like, you know, conservation as part of their, you know, nature-based nonprofits, which are excellent. Those, you know, I would say that those, you know, serve the greater good, you know, of the public. So, you know, would we want to exclude those folks? Because, you know, that's, if you're a nonprofit who serves, or is like primary focus is the environment and, you know, conservation, you could also make the argument that, you know, they're not necessarily serving the low income population, but we know that, you know, if you're conserving land to be a park, for example, you know, it's open to all and benefits society equally, regardless of income. So it would be tricky to word, you know, again, I agree this, like, I like where we're going with this, but I think, like, in terms of the wording, like, how do we kind of like make the cutoff, for example, you know, of determining who would be eligible for this, like what's considered, serving the LMI population. So I'm tempted to say something like, nonprofits in general could get credited in that way, but then again, nonprofits is a very broad umbrella.
Right, and it's coming out of the low income and moderate income buckets, I think, or that's how I'd interpret it, because there's nothing to stop you from serving these in general. It's the benefit of serving low income households. So your low income credit obligation could be served by doing a shelter in addition to a low income renter or owner household. So I do think it should be narrowly tailored, and I'm wondering if it should be something like, I think we should think this through, but like the site at which those services are provided, like VHFA is our low and moderate income households are in our mission statement, but like, I don't know that our building that we do banking things is the same as a shelter or a food bank and has that kind of direct benefit. Like, I do think I think it maybe we should kick around language about like the site at which households are served.
We
It's a
keep
good point.
circling back to like shelters and food banks as our main examples. Do we want to limit it to shelters and food banks as like the main two services that we're thinking of that directly are serving low income households and providing anti-poverty services, or are there like other types of nonprofits that we really would like to see included in this?
It's a good question. You could say health clinics potentially. I think that's a different project, but some of those are nonprofits like the community health centers or something like the Howard Center. I don't know. I'm thinking about like, I think some of that gets into like places that offer general services and also, so maybe it's I'm just thinking of the definition rather than figuring out like what types of buildings. Maybe it's like a nonprofit with a mission to serve low-income households, and the low-income households or those households are served on that site. We could even tie it to like, I don't know, there's some sort of assistance program. Like I'm thinking of how like OEO wraps around a lot of different services, and if you qualify for one thing, you don't have to qualify again. So we could see about tying it to like, is this nonprofit organization receiving funds for anti-poverty services and offering the services in this building? That kind of test. I mean, maybe receiving the state and federal money isn't important, but that usually has strings to determine, who can and can't, qualify for a service. So I don't know, maybe that's not a helpful definition.
But also, if you are receiving those, federal state dollars earmarked for, certain basically anti-poverty or aimed at assisting the low-income population, there's usually that's in my mind that should be like an automatic qualifier in a sense. Like if you're an organization that receives like these federal dollars that are specifically earmarked, there's like an application process to get these dollars to serve the low income population. It's like, then you qualify. Like that would be, and I think I like where you're going with like the, the built specific buildings and stuff. However, knowing, I'm thinking of an organization like CVOEO, for example, or any of the CAP agencies around the state, many of them have multiple buildings. And given that they're all part of the same organization, I think it probably would make sense to make any of those buildings that they own eligible, so that because in one building they might have a Head Start program, the other building might be their weatherization portion or family services portion. And given that they're all under the same organization, maybe we make anything owned by them eligible, just because that's where basically that's who's paying rent at the property, or paying the mortgage. So that would make the definition a little easier, I think. But
yeah, I know. And I was just saying, like, again, I don't know if like say you only have an office that doesn't like the low income households who will benefit never go to this office. Like the VHFA example, where we're B2B, we help low income households, but it's in a indirect way. No one's coming to our office. Like, I just don't know if that's what this is intended to help. I don't think there's a huge chance for mismanagement of this if we tailor it to like, you're receiving state and federal funds to do this work. I just think certainly you'd want to see the benefits help the, the buildings that, low and moderate income households will interact with more directly. I guess that's where I'm getting at. Like, you could have a head office type of thing where I'm like, it's for a nonprofit that might deserve it, but it might not like directly serve I don't know. I think you could, it'll be hard to figure out where to draw the line on that, I guess.
No, yeah, I get it. I get what you're saying. But then on the other hand, to be the devil's advocate here, I guess any, services provided to, say, that main office where clients are not, directly accessing, may help the organization save money, which they could then in turn use to bolster programs to then further serve low income folks. So I'm just thinking like an organization wide, any way that they can benefit from clean heat would be a net positive to the population that they serve. So maybe the wording just generally, like if we're gonna try to define, draw boundaries around this group that we're talking about, should probably include the wording that is gets at, basically anti-poverty. I think that would be indicative of serving, a lower income bracket. And it would be, yeah, and that, if we're thinking about nonprofits broadly, then it gets into like, for example, places of worship, churches, synagogues, other places like that those are all nonprofits.
Yeah,
And oftentimes they have an, anti-poverty, or part of their mission.
and I think in that case, oh, sorry, go on, Emily.
No, this is kind of off topic, so we could come back to this if you want to continue your thought, Mia, but my thought, this isn't fully formulated, but I'm just trying to think about like what number, I know we don't know a lot of this information, which is why this isn't fully formed, but like what number of credits projects like this for a business might generate in the cost versus like a low income, moderate income household. And I'm just trying to think about like, if there's a lot of these projects, will there be more incentive to do these projects versus a low income household? I don't really have an answer, but I'm just thinking about.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. I would say I don't think there's a direct like displacement likely. I mean, I think my general theory of how this is going to work is kind of like credits will go where they're already being generated, or credits will be generated from things that are already happening. And so something like the WAP program or EEU programs that already have incentives to kind of grease the wheels of this type of activity seem to be the most likely. So I don't think, I think these like doing a shelter or something might be sort of a larger building where you could get more credits than doing like a single low income household, but you'd have to connect with them somehow. And I don't know. I know like Efficiency Vermont, for example, has rebates available for businesses and stuff. And do you do anything special for nonprofits, or is it the same as a business?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can circle back. I know that we have done work with nonprofits, but I don't know the difference in support and programs.
Okay, so yeah, like I just don't think like obligated entities are going to be like quick to take up the, like they might be more credit generating projects, like easier to do more activities in one building than a single home, but on the other hand, you'd have to like find these nonprofit organizations and figure out a way, like I just don't know that a lot of that is happening. So I mean, it's a good point. Like the more like exceptions, which this sort of is, the less directly goes to low income households. But I think shelters are a great example where the clean heat standard doesn't offer anything for us to reach these households unless we come up with an exception, essentially. So I think it just offers some flexibility, but probably won't change things drastically, but it's not a bad thing to have for equity reasons.
Sure. Yeah, it would definitely, yeah, just kind of thinking through it as we talk here, I think, if we did narrow the scope to, specifically kind of hone in on like shelters, for example, a shelter is basically, that's housing for folks that are unhoused. So that would be a way that those folks can effectively take advantage of, they would be benefiting from a clean heat measure while they are at the shelter. which would increase their comfort and, quality of life, during the periods they are at the shelter. Same with a food pantry or, and then again, the question in my mind is like a place of worship. Those are places that are open to anyone typically. If you're unhoused, you can still go to a place of worship. And if that place of worship were to benefit from a clean heat measure, then, while those folks are there, they would be benefiting, and it would be essentially, they'd be, taking advantage of the clean heat measures there. But yeah, I guess I'm leaning more towards like, if we're going to, I think we should draw the boundaries a little bit broader, because I think it's going to be difficult. We've talked about it many times that, getting the required statutory requirement of the LMI credits for the obligated parties could prove to be difficult. We don't, getting at the exact numbers, as we talked about last meeting, we don't know for sure how difficult that might be. It's sort of like we need to see how the credit market plays out. But I think increasing the umbrella of like basically institutions or organizations, nonprofit organizations specifically, that would be eligible for obligated parties to receive LMI credits from them, I think would be a net positive. I'm not super worried about, bringing all these organizations under the umbrella of LMI, eligible credit places. That I don't think that would take away from, doing residences, because, if we are talking about something like weatherization, for example, it probably would be pretty difficult to do like a house of worship, for example. Weatherizing a church would be quite the project. So I don't know, as though, well, I think it'd be great. I don't know how many weatherization contractors would necessarily go out seeking these jobs, because I'm guessing they would be pretty expensive, and different shaped buildings, etc. Probably at that point be easier for them to weatherize just a regular residence. With a shelter, I mean, I guess I want to pose the question to you guys, like, what's your thoughts on, like, we got to create bounds before we kind of narrow the scope, because if we say nonprofit, that's very broad. I think we agree that it has to serve, has to be a organization that serves specifically low income. So if that's the case, then where do you draw the line? It's
This
tough.
might also be a nice point to open up for public comment, if we have any. So basically the conversation has been around writing a memo in response to opening up credits for LMI serving entities, and we've been talking about the parameters, so organizations. Some of the parameters that have been suggested or organizations should be nonprofits with a mission to serve low income households. We're still debating on whether or not the services should be tied to that site. There should be some element of anti-poverty or poverty reduction. And then there's the question of what those nonprofits should be. Can they just be the anti-poverty nonprofits? Can they be community health centers, places of worship? Schools are also nonprofits many of the times. Yes, so if we have any comments from the public, anybody who wants to weigh in, as you know, we normally do 2 minutes and then circle back. So any public comment? All right, hearing none, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd agree with the church just because they can be exclusionary. Like, there's nothing to stop someone from kicking someone out of the church, like technically. I think the test should probably be, and I also, I think this is something we could kick back to the legislature and be like, come up with a workable legal definition. Here are some elements we think are good. And someone who's like better at writing laws can come up with something that's like enforceable. But I was thinking maybe a two-part test to say, like, you have a mission statement to serve low and moderate income households, and I guess primarily low and moderate income households. and you're receiving state or federal dollars to assist in serving low-income households. I think that would exclude schools, which frankly, I do think that's a much bigger market, and schools aren't primarily there to help low-income households, they're to help everybody. So I think that two-part test of like a clear mission that you're serving low and moderate income households and that you're receiving state dollars to assist low-income households, and that would qualify you for, and I don't think anyone is substantively serving low-income households without receiving state or federal dollars to do it. I'm sure there's one-off activities like a church or something, but not on any significant scale. So I think tying the state or federal dollars would keep our organization narrow, and the mission statement would kind of exclude schools, which is just a bigger picture thing.
Right. Yeah, and if it was a school, I guess if you were to use the wording you just sort of suggested, whereas having like a mission statement, or some way to kind of show that you're part of the reason why you exist is to serve low income. I suppose you could have a private school or something that is mission is to serve the low income students or something. So that would be a one-off. But in your example, it would be sort of doesn't really matter what you do as long as you serve low income and you're nonprofit, then you could be eligible or put under that kind of eligibility to be considered for LMI credits. I think that's probably the best way to do it, just so that we don't have to like necessarily put a definition on like type of building or type of organization. It's just like broadly, do you exist to serve low and moderate income?
And Ben, just to clarify, just so I get this down, you said it doesn't matter the type of organization. Are you saying nonprofit matters or doesn't matter in that definition?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think,
just to be clear.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of playing the devil's advocate here because I want to kind of flesh out the issue, but I guess in theory, if you're a for-profit organization that exists to serve, let's say being for-profit allows you to serve a greater number of low or moderate income people. Is that necessarily a bad thing that they're for-profit? Probably in my mind, I guess if you're helping people, if your mission as a for-profit company is to help people, that's a good thing. And if you had in your mission statement, it can kind of show that that's what you exist for, then I suppose why would we should exclude them. But that said, it's like, there's a money-making side of that. So if they're making money doing what they're doing, do they necessarily need to be aided or, yeah, it's a good question. But I guess in my mind, it's just like, I want to I think the more organizations and institutions that are eligible to be considered as LMI in the eyes of an obligated party looking to meet their requirement, I think the better, because then that would, it only benefits the organizations, that are then going on to serve that portion of the population. But I think it's probably safer, kind of all that said, probably safer to keep it on the nonprofit side of things. Just on the assumption that if you're for profit, you should be able to use that profit towards, paying for or funding your energy improvement project. But yeah, so I think let's stick with nonprofit for now, unless anybody else has a reaction to what I just said. But I think probably nonprofit's the safe way to go.
I think that makes sense to me. And I also, I like having that like general recommendation that's more high level, and then maybe also including the recommendation to like highlight this for the legislature. So giving some parameters, but maybe just like flagging this.
Yeah. Possible. Yeah, I think the intent of this probably should be to put an amendment in for the legislature to consider, because, in terms of creating this definition, obviously this conversation kind of shows that would be a great issue for the legislature to, that's what they do. They're, representatives from around the state and they know their communities best. So they would be able to advocate for all the various institutions that they know of, to have this designation. So that would probably be, but I think the idea of it is really the important part. And I think the bounds that we should probably recommend, to be taken up there would be what you said a little bit ago, Mia, was the anti-poverty, have a specific mission statement that that shows that the reason why you exist is to serve the lower end of the income spectrum. So that would be a must in my mind. There's you have to kind of clearly show that. So.
And I think that the legislature could workshop this, because I'm not convinced everyone has a mission statement that just specifically gets to that, but I don't know, I think we just have to clarify that we don't mean schools, quite frankly, when we talk about this, so that sort of incidentally serve low income people. So I think the mission statement is one thing. I just that's not a legal document. You can change your mission statement. So maybe we say a primary purpose of existing or something like that. And I think that's something where I don't know that the obligated parties, or I guess the PUC determining the legitimacy of those credits, really is going to be able to determine. But I think the idea of proof that you're receiving state or federal dollars is probably enough when we tailor it to okay, on its face of it, it should be an organization that exists for that. I do think it's going to be hard to verify, but I do think we need to take it out of the realm of people who sort of accidentally serve low income people and receive some money to do that. So so I'll just say a primary purpose to serve primarily low and moderate income households. We could workshop that, but I think that'll be fairly self-evident.
Yep.
And we can mention that there is a real question about how you're going to prove that. I think if you can prove that you have a contract with OEO or AHS or something, it's pretty good proof without going in and checking the income levels of people. But I don't know, beyond that, it's going to be a little bit of a judgment call that's going to make it harder for this to work.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, and the nonprofit aspect as well, because I just kind of popped into my head. It's well, what does a for-profit company would be like Coca-Cola? You could say they serve the low-income population, or any company, So I think that definitely the nonprofit side would be is definitely in the bounds that we're talking about.
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that works. And then one thing I wanted to circle back to is, so I'm thinking they asked about LMI credits, and I think we've established that there are organizations that serve up to moderate income. There's not too many that just serve moderate income and not low income households. I don't know whether there's any point, my kind of vibe with this is that this is a low income credit generating activity, and we're kind of relying on this whole state and federal dollars assisting low income households to make it work. I just don't see a practical way to come up with a moderate income credit out of this, but just because I don't, I think you can say I'm thinking of so shelters are definitely low income households. You could have something like CBOEO, which does some other stuff as well. And I guess in that example, I think you'd have to have the low income activities kind of carry the day for that organization. You know what I mean? It's going to be a weird mix, and I just don't know how you get moderate income credits out of this in that way. But if either of you have thoughts on where to define that, I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, I'm not sure we do though, because I think the wording in the statute is low and moderate income. I like where you're going with that, Mia, but I think just thinking of the statutory language, it's low income 16%, from low income households, and then 16% from low and moderate. So.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure we would necessarily need to draw that delineation, but I think you're right. That might be, even if that were the case, I don't know if that might be a frivolous kind of thing, because it's I don't think any nonprofit exists to say we only serve moderate income. Oh, you're low income, we're not going to serve you. That would be just ridiculous to say. It's let's think about that.
That's a good point. I forgot the low and moderate. So I guess if say I'm an obligated party and I somehow got a credit from an installation in one of these buildings, I think I would automatically want that to go to my low and moderate income, my low income requirements specifically, because we expect that those credits are going to be more valuable because they're harder to obtain. So in that, I don't know why you would want that to go towards your low and moderate income. It's an important distinction, low and moderate income obligation, but like, I guess there's no reason why you can't. I just think in this scenario, we're kind of assuming that they could go towards either category, and people would probably assume the low income category. So I guess that's fine. I was trying to figure out how you'd square that. Maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah, but I think what you just said, yeah, I agree. Yeah, so that's probably what they're gonna do.
I think that makes the most sense. And you know, if you for some reason have all your low income credits and need moderate income credits, like sure, I guess, but or I guess low and I keep calling them moderate income, but you're right, Ben, they're not. So
Yeah.
so
And
I
also,
think that's fine.
Yeah. So I think we can. It would be sort of implied, I think, is what we're talking about. Yeah, like just basically what you said. So yeah, I think is this in terms of a deliverable, like memo format, like what are we thinking? Like, I don't think we necessarily need like a multi-page document here. I think pretty much sort of like a really brief, you know, a couple paragraphs, just like to set bounds on like what we're thinking for that. This would be something that the full EAG considers to then send on to the commission for consideration, and then it, you know, they do with it what they will. But
yeah, I think that sounds good. And it sounds like the PUC is anxious to have us weigh in on this. So I imagine that's part of their thinking, and getting a definition will help, or at least our proposed definition. Yeah, and I think we should explain the whole like why we don't think this is going to hurt low income households, because we don't think it's going to like destabilize the market in any way, or take a, you know, make it less likely to perform low income credits that directly benefit rather than sort of indirectly benefit low income households. So I think adding that context, that we see it as just more flexibility and other pathways for people to be served, and we think there's minimal risk of crowding out. I think that's a question that the PUC may be interested in.
right, and I think we should definitely include language as well that sort of narrows, like points in the direction of like our primary thinking on this, which is to, you know, primarily looking at like shelters and food pantries, food banks and stuff that are like overtly like for the low income community. And you know, back to that point that I made a little bit ago, just about, you know, shelters being like, that is the, you know, could be a primary place of residence for a homeless individual who, you know, maybe they receive mail there, you know, so that is how you bring that population into the fold to benefit from clean heat measures. So
I think even if we're not limiting it to those two examples, like using those as two clear examples of what we're thinking about might be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so I think we can remove health clinics from that. I think we should just say, like, when we're talking about this, we mean shelters and food banks, but don't intend to limit it to those organizations specifically. So I think that makes sense to say, like, it's going to be a gray area for things that aren't that, but I think you could, like, COEO is a good example. They offer like a lot of different types of services in one building. And so, yeah, I think it's, you know, we could even say, you know, wraparound anti-poverty organizations and stuff that do all sorts of stuff.
Agreed. And I do think if we word it properly, and I think kind of what we just said about, you know, shelters, food banks, you in by virtue of the language would end up, you know, encompassing, like, for example, like a house of worship who also has a food bank, like maybe attached to that building. Like that would be, if, you know, what we're talking about here, that would be fine by me. You know, that makes sense. It's like, doesn't really matter if you're a food bank or a food bank. Doesn't, you know, so it's going to, it would encompass places like that as well, as long as you're a nonprofit.
Yeah, and I think
that's what we said.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
And I think we can explain the whole, like, you have to come up with your definition, so you don't include schools, which we have nothing against, but is going to get to be a much bigger scale very quickly. So I think that's something to flag, saying like, you do need to get sort of the low and moderate income specific definition in there. Otherwise you're going to run into other problems of like a hospital, honestly. You don't want that to qualify because that's just a way bigger scale than I think we intended to do. So yeah, because they're nonprofits and receive state and federal dollars to help low income households. So
yep. Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree. I think we should, what you just said about schools, because again, there's like a million different like iterations of this, but you know, if you're a school in like a designated district that is like, you know, the majority of your students are low income, that would technically be like a say a public school that, you know, has 60% of the population of the students that is low income students. But I think what, you know, because technically that would make them qualify for this designation of like an LMI thing, but I think at that point it's like a federal, state, municipal funded building already, so it's like a different category in my mind of a nonprofit, so to speak. But I think, yeah, the language that we just talked about would basically indicate that we're not referring to hospitals and schools. So,
and I think just putting that as a sort of note for the legislature and the PUC, like just kind of be careful at how large the universe is, because we know if the universe gets too large, that has a crowding out, that could have a crowding out effect, where we're less likely to see the credits go to low income households just by the size of some of these projects. So,
yep.
Okay, I think that sounds good. And just mention, like, I think verification is a question. I think you could sort of use this sort of like proof of like the state or federal contract is pretty much on its face. And you know, the mission statement is more of a judgment call, but I think it should be a basic test that like don't try this. I mean, there's no way to verify directly, but I think it's sort of a common sense standard. And then you could use documentation of this contract with OEO or, you know, AHS or something as sort of the proof that you're offering for these low income services. So I think that wouldn't require income verifying individual people, because that's already probably being done to some extent. Like, you know, I think food banks and shelters, even if they're not individually doing that, there are some safeguards to kind of confirm that they're using that money. So
yeah, I would agree with that.
okay. Yeah, I think it's a real definition problem, but I think we've gotten a good start, and the legislature could run with that and make it like legally, you know, clear intent. So I think that sounds good.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, and from verification too, if you're an obligated party that put a heat pump in, you know, at a food bank, you could submit along with like the documentation of your to get credit verification, like to the department, you know, just a little piece of paper that says like this is the, you know, like the South Burlington Food Bank or whatever, you know, and it would be very clear.
Yeah, I do think the obligated party or whoever is getting the credit has some responsibility to just like, you like, for example, if they're coming to my house, I can't say also a food bank, and then they're just like, okay, you know, like I think there's got to be, I think that's a larger question of verification that we've kind of avoided, and I think we've thought like we don't want to totally upend the system, but I guess that's something for them to think about. Like, you know, you wanted like the obligated party or whoever ends up with this credit has some burden on this, but it shouldn't be an extensive one, I guess. So maybe just flag that like that's going to have to make sense with their ultimate compliance system, but you know, it should be reasonable.
Yeah, well, the address will be attached to the credit claim. True. So, you know, at the department, we could just search the address, and if it's like somebody's house, you know, it's like, well, that might not be a food bank, you know, so it'd be pretty, I feel like at that point, it'd be pretty obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think, I don't know. I mean, the department's not going to have, like, no one's going to have the ability to individually check. I mean, I'm sure there'll be audits and stuff, but yeah, I just think it's the whole, like, I don't think we want to make a process where like a shelter has to like deliberately prove they're a shelter, but they could say like, well, here's documentation of our contract with AHS to be a shelter, and that's probably fine, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yep. That'd be great.
Yeah. We can just say like, think about this PUC when you think about what you're asking people to document, that like there's probably a middle ground between taking people at their word and extensively verifying that. So okay, I think that sounds great. I think we did great work. I think the full EAG may have thoughts about what we've said, but I think that this will be, there'll be pretty good consensus that this is worthwhile and we're on the mostly the right track. So before we move on, do either of you have anything? We can take one more public comment on this in case. Do either of you have any thoughts on what else we need in this?
I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah,
Okay,
I don't have anything else.
Okay, awesome. So let's open it up to public comment again, if in case there's anything on this that anyone from the public would like us to address. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. I have one more thing that I wanted to talk about before we go. So this is more of sort of a philosophical question that we've kind of touched on, but so I've been sort of increasing the mind that I think we're doing good work with things like taking credit front loading seriously and talking about exception for low income serving institutions. But I think in a broader sense, what the EAG has been driving towards is a lot of the sort of things that will make this work on an equity basis are not really achievable in the clean heat standard itself. Like we've talked about, the legislature needs to figure out how to do, overcome the split incentive, and enabling upgrades are something that we haven't really figured out a way to get that out of a credit scheme. So I think that's fine. I don't think that's a problem. And I think it's clearly in our Act 18 is to, propose alternate things that I think the legislature clearly intended that there are going to be things that are outside the clean heat standard that are something we could recommend. So I think that's fine. I just wanted to sort of gut check if for example, the credit requirements for low and moderate income households kind of take it outside this just credits, the more credits you get, the more greenhouse gas emissions you reduce, the more credits you get. And then the low and moderate income credits are kind of a deviation from that, but the legislature recognized that it's necessary. And I was thinking that there's no real reason why you couldn't do this for saying a portion of your credits need to come from renters or something like that. I think the more things we stick into that, the more complicated and the more, potentially destabilizing it is. But we kind of touched on this with front loading. There's nothing to stop us from suggesting that the legislature or the PUC deviate and make credits more specific. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of appetite, but I don't want to just say our work is done with the clean heat standard itself. Let's propose legislative programs. So I thought that would be a good discussion to have, how comfortable we are with saying we've sort of done what we can within this clean heat standard framework itself. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So are you saying that we should consider kind of carving out additional criterion for credits, ownership rules, etc., kind of revisiting some of those topics and being more specific to some of the populations we want to ensure are served under this? Or are you saying that we should kind of draw the line and then start? But I guess that's the question right now.
Yeah. So I'm not really saying we should. I guess I've just been sort of increasingly saying in meetings with ourselves, amongst ourselves and partners, that a lot of what we're going to do is outside of the clean heat standard framework itself. And that makes me a little uncomfortable that maybe we aren't doing everything we can with sort of what's in front of us. I don't think we're missing anything big, but I just don't think it's fair to say well, there's nothing we can do for renters specifically within the clean heat standard. Technically you could say that you have to get a certain percentage of your credits from renters. And I think I'm not actually suggesting that. I think just because it seems like the complexity offers more drawbacks than advantages, I just want to be really comfortable that we're dealing with the clean heat standard itself and making sure that we've considered all the possible equity angles and we feel good about where we are in that respect. Does that make sense? It's more just a random thought that popped into my head of we could get more radical with this if we wanted to. I don't know that anyone has the appetite for doing that, but I think we should think about it seriously.
I don't have any formulated thoughts about yeah, like what additional requirements, but I definitely want to keep thinking about that and have more discussions. I think it's an important thought. The one thing that does come up is thinking about like the gaps and barriers in our demographic section, and
Mhm.
with those requirements, I guess I'm interested when the potential study comes out with a workforce analysis. I think we should be prepared to have some of our recommendations and gaps and barriers be connected to that, knowing yeah, what's possible now in terms of workforce and resources, and that question of like what will it take past just additional funding for the standard to get
Mhm.
additional incremental work done, especially for those populations that may be underserved due to barriers that currently exist. So
And I think we are making good progress at discussing some of those things in our specific topic issues. I think it's going to be important work for us to actually like formulate them into like something coherent, which we're going to talk about that next week, actually, about how to start taking some of these threads and like getting a little bit more specific with recommendations. But yeah, I don't know. I you know, I just feel like there's relatively little there, I guess comparatively little within the clean heat standard itself. And I just want to make sure that we're not missing anything within like things we could specifically tell the PUC to do for the clean heat standard that we haven't already suggested versus telling the legislature they need a program for X, Y, and Z. You know what I mean? That seems fundamental to me. And I think it's just good to check that we feel kind of comfortable with that paradigm, I guess I should say.
Yeah, maximizing or leveraging the clean heat standard to the maximum extent possible, basically, to ensure we get as much equity out of it as possible. Because really, the framework, for the clean heat standard has already been set up. So I think you're right. It's like it probably warrants, a little bit of homework on our part to kind of go back through the statute and see what other opportunities might jump out at us to, for further equity considerations. But yeah, I see what you're saying for sure, because it'd be more valuable to use the act that's already been, put in motion here than, hey, start from scratch. We have this other idea outside of it, yeah. So how can we leverage equity to within the clean heat standard as much as possible? But yeah, I like where you're going with that. I guess, yeah, for me, I would have to go back to the statute and see if there's anything I'm missing.
Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, the renter thing is like one of the types of things where you could do different classes of credits to help the people we're more, especially concerned about. I just think that's a big undertaking, and based on our front loading discussion, something we might not have the appetite for. But I think we should just like, yeah, look at the box and then think of what we could do with that box, I guess, of kind of what we have, and just make sure that we're comfortable with that. I don't think we're missing anything huge. I've been veering more and more towards like what is outside the clean heat standard, and I want to make sure we don't lose track of what's directly in front of us. I do think we have some work we can do on consumer protection, which we've sort of touched on, but I think that's something we could revisit to make sure our implementation recommendations have some sort of safeguards in that someone is sort of tracking equity. I think that's something we could do and has a sort of direct PUC clean heat standard, framework in there. But yeah, I'm not seeing a ton, but it's always good to make sure that we're not missing something really significant that we should be talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a great point. Yeah, and I too don't think we're missing anything major, but to the extent that there might be little kind of nuggets of information we can pull from the statute that it's like, oh, we could, expand upon minor points that we might be able to, that wouldn't require, a separate piece of legislation. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Hi, Matt. Let's see. I can get you up to speed if you have a sec on what we discussed, and make sure that you have a chance to weigh in on any thoughts before we bring it back to the full EAG.
I really apologize. I had multiple meetings and I'm also traveling, so I'm just trying to catch up.
Sure. Well, I'll go over it really quick, and then we can make sure we have public comment before we wrap up. We didn't see anything else for the DDA memo, so we think we're just going to take that back to the full EAG, make sure that there's time for additions, and hopefully get a vote on sending those recommendations on DDA selection to the PUC after that meeting. And then we had a great discussion on the idea of credits for low and moderate income serving institutions. And I think we came up with a good, pretty narrowly tailored but effective definition for essentially how to get the credits into institutions like food shelves and shelters, and without opening that pool too wide or kind of increasing too many burdens. So that would be essentially elective, like if a credit is produced from those activities, a low and an obligated party could use a credit from those institutions as well. So I will send that with a group, would welcome your thoughts, but I think we came up with a good starting definition of what that would include. And then the final thing we discussed just now was I encouraged the group to think about, what we can do within the framework of the clean heat standard that we're not already considering in terms of low and moderate income benefits. I think us three agreed that we've got a lot of it covered, but the EAG discussion has moved increasingly at complementary programs, and just double checking that we're not missing anything within the clean heat standard framework itself that we could grapple with. So we'll take that up next time if anyone has a chance to mull that over. So let me know, Matt, if you have any thoughts on any of that you want me to incorporate.
That sounds great. I look forward to learning more. Thank you very much for the summary.
Okay, great. Anything else before I take it to public comment one last time? Okay, let's open it up then. Any public comment, please raise your hand if you do. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Well, this has been quick, but I think very productive. If there's nothing else, I will follow up with Ashira on, materials for the full EAG to review, and I think we're in good shape.
Great. Yeah.
Okay, I'll call this to a close. Thanks for the great discussion.
Yeah, thanks. We'll catch you guys later.
Thanks, everyone.